Hi everyone. For those who are coming into the Zoom now, we're just going to give it a minute or two to let a few more people enter, and then I'll start the seminar. Just going to give it another minute just for people that are entering the seminar now. We'll just give it one more minute for people to continue joining us, and then we'll begin. All right, I think we might start now. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people upon whose lands I currently live and work, and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society's Research and Practice Seminar Series. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Renee Fomiati and I'm a Research Officer at ARCSHS. This month, we have Dr. Stephen Molldrem joining us to speak about molecular HIV surveillance. Stephen Molldrem is a UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the University of California, Irvine, and an incoming Assistant Professor at the University of Texas Medical Branch. Stephen is a qualitative researcher primarily situated in science and technology studies and critical bioethics, and he has an interest in using Marxist frameworks to analyse key problems in health policy, public health ethics, and the governance and use of infectious disease data across different domains of practice. Stephen's going to speak for about 45 minutes, followed by question time afterwards. I'd encourage everyone in question time just to raise your virtual hand and I can switch on your mic if you'd like to ask your question yourself, but also please feel free to submit a question via the chat function. I'm going to hand over to you now, Stephen.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee. I really appreciate it. And hello to everyone. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you all today from the traditional lands of the Salt River Pima and Maricopa people. And as Renee mentioned, I'm finishing my time as a UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow at UC Irvine, where I'm in the Department of Anthropology. And in September, I will be an Assistant Professor at the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston, where my primary duties will be in the Institute for Bioethics and Health Humanities. And so while I'm situated and will be drawing on critical bioethics, public health ethics, policy studies, and science and technology studies today, I'm also going to be drawing on some social and political theory in the Marxist tradition, and specifically work in the idiom of 20th century Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, to discuss developments that I've seen emerging in what are at this point very protracted, ongoing, and escalating conflicts between actors in state public health agencies and HIV civil society over the past several years, starting in 2018, over molecular HIV surveillance and cluster detection and response programs, which I'll explain more about as we go along. I describe these conflicts as new struggles over hegemony in the governance of HIV because I have found that they are starting to go beyond issues raised by molecular cluster detection and response to raise basic questions about the appropriate role of public health agencies and public health data infrastructures in contemporary societies. This is particularly following developments in digital health and applications of genomic science in public health that have really accelerated over the last decade, in which I'm going to review now. So since 2015, I've been studying transformations in US HIV public health data infrastructures that are related to the rollout of public health programs that are designed to advance HIV treatment as prevention as a domestic public health strategy. So as most of you probably know, HIV treatment as prevention, which is often abbreviated as TASP, has emerged as a main public health strategy for managing HIV/AIDS epidemics since confirmation emerged during the first 2 decades of the 2000s that people living with HIV who are retained in treatment with a suppressed viral load cannot transmit HIV, effectively zero risk of transmitting HIV if you have an undetectable viral load. And treatment as prevention has been popularized internationally through the slogan U equals U, which is short for undetectable equals untransmittable. And it's also reoriented the management of HIV epidemics. My work in this area has focused on the rollout of US public health programs that are designed to support tasks, including programs called molecular HIV surveillance, which is abbreviated as MHS, and cluster detection and response programs, which is abbreviated as CDR. MHS and CDR programs are public health programs that repurpose a specific kind of clinical HIV data that is collected from people living with HIV during routine medical visits, and this data is called HIV Genetic Sequence Data. These data are used for epidemiological surveillance and then prevention outreach to individuals who are identified as part of transmission clusters using these methods. So before I get to a detailed explanation of what MHS and CDR are, I want to first note and underscore that the analysis of HIV genetic sequence data in public health surveillance and prevention programs has raised a lot of alarm bells among HIV advocates, and especially over the last couple of years among people in networks, organized networks of people living with HIV. And this is because of the very detailed information that the analysis of HIV genetic sequence data can reveal, such as transmission dynamics between subgroups or tightly knit groups of people in what are called transmission clusters, where recent transmission might be inferred, and the potential presence of antiretroviral drug resistance within a population sample. HIV genetic sequence data and analyses of them can reveal information like this. In October of last year, I published a paper in the American Journal of Bioethics with Anthony K.J. Smith of UNSW Sydney that documented early controversies over MHS and CDR in the United States. So that paper analyzed published papers and public conflicts between institutional public health actors like the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, activists, and researchers who use these methods. That paper generated a lot of discussion from a wide array of perspectives because of the unique format of the American Journal of Bioethics, which solicits and publishes responses to articles. Ours received 12 total replies. And as a follow-up to that work, I've just completed an interview, and you can see that paper there. And as a follow-up to that work, I've just completed an interview study with 26 participants, all of whom are US-based HIV stakeholders who have self-identified to me as having criticisms or concerns about the rollout of MHS and CDR programs. The sample is very diverse, speaking demographically and in regard to folks' professions and where they live and work in the United States. Some of the participants are activists, others are researchers based at universities, and some are people who actually work for public health agencies, some of whom have actively implemented MHS and CDR, but still have criticisms and concerns. Many of the people in this sample are people living with HIV, some of whom are connected to organized networks of people living with HIV, and I'm starting to analyze data from this interview study, and this talk is really the first presentation of the early findings from that project. So my talk today will proceed in 3 main sections. The first deals with the recent history of HIV surveillance and prevention in the United States, and I will give an overview of the history of MHS and CDR programs in the country. And we'll focus on issues that advocates and critical public health scholars have raised about the methods and data infrastructures that facilitate MHS and CDR programs, with an emphasis on their historical development and on new risks that are posed by HIV phylogenetics, which are the main set of methods that make MHS and CDR possible. In the second part, I will go a bit further back to the history of US public health data infrastructures, and we'll describe how US public health data infrastructures and HIV infrastructures changed during the 2010s. I will also present some data from my interview study and my central argument today, which is essentially that the rollout of HIV molecular surveillance and cluster detection and response programs in the United States, along with critical reactions to the rollout of these programs that have been led largely by networks of people living with HIV have together shifted the basic terms of debate in regard to how US public health agencies ought to be permitted to collect and reuse individuals' routine clinical data for public health purposes. By instigating controversies about questions such as whether public health agencies should have to seek patients' consent to reuse their clinical HIV data or allow individuals living with HIV to opt out of surveillance, conflicts over MHS and CDR have opened a proverbial Pandora's box of problems that have generally thought to be settled matters in HIV public health policy and practice. And then in the third section, after we discuss that, I will discuss the implications of this argument in light of the evidence I bring, and I will draw on the Gramscian analytical idiom to describe how conflicts over MHS and CDR and the future of public health surveillance in the United States are creating what I call new struggles over hegemony in the governance of HIV. Using Gramsci's concepts of the war of position and the war of movement, I will describe the contours of conflicts over MHS and CDR as they have manifested in public conflicts and in my interview study. I will also discuss why MHS and CDR raise such deep questions about the role of institutional public health in contemporary societies in light of recent controversies. The analysis that I present about conflicts over the implementation of MHS and CDR and the examples that I draw from my recent interview study demonstrate my central claim, that is, that conflicts over the implementation of molecular HIV surveillance and cluster detection and response programs are not only questioning the validity of uses of HIV phylogenetics in public health programs, but that they are also restructuring basic debates about the legitimacy of core public health practices, such as surveillance programs run by health departments that reuse individuals' clinical data without consent or community oversight. Seen in this light, criticisms of MHS and CDR appear as very consequential for the future of public health in the US and elsewhere because they take aim at the core features of the US public health data apparatus and the policy paradigms that support them, that apparatus. These conflicts reveal new struggles over hegemony in the governance of HIV that are taking place now and also hint at larger issues that may structure future conflicts. So in the United States, since the 1980s, all state departments of public health and some large city and county departments of public health have operated infrastructures called HIV surveillance system using guidelines from CDC. HIV surveillance systems are very complicated data infrastructures. And over the years, as the US health data ecology has become more complex, interoperable, and digitized, HIV surveillance systems have become able to take in more and more different kinds of data for an increasing range of both epidemiological and prevention reuses. One key feature of US HIV surveillance is the mandatory names-based reporting of all new HIV cases, as well as names-based results from routinely collected blood tests that are ordered for HIV patients by their medical providers every 6 months, and that's mainly HIV viral load and CD4 T cell tests. In 2018, CDC added HIV genetic sequence data to required HIV surveillance reporting. HIV genetic sequence data are also generated from clinical tests, HIV genotype tests that are ordered by clinicians for patients living with HIV, usually upon initial entry to HIV care or after a person re-engages in care after a period of being out of care. In the clinical context, these HIV genotype tests are used to identify potential antiretroviral drug resistance and to help providers prescribe appropriate antiviral medications. However, in the public health context, tracing patterns of evolution in viral genetic sequences can yield many useful and detailed epidemiological insights. So, as I said, in 2018, CDC began requiring jurisdictional departments of public health, those are in states and counties and some large cities, to use HIV genetic sequence data in routine surveillance to identify people living with HIV in what are called clusters of other people living with HIV with genetically similar, genetically related strains of HIV. In 2019, cluster detection and response, or CDR programs involving outreach to people using molecular surveillance data was announced as the fourth pillar of ending the HIV epidemic, a new federal strategy. Programs such as MHS and CDR that employ approaches from genomic epidemiology, a subfield of epidemiology, mainly involve the use of phylogenetic methods to track patterns of viral evolution in population data sets. These methods are generally published and maintained as open source software tools and are used to analyze HIV genetic sequences that are reported to public health agencies by testing laboratories. Public health departments in the US use a software called Secure HIV Trace, a browser-based version shown there on the left of an open source software called HIV Trace, there shown on the right, to analyze HIV genetic sequence data in order to determine which individuals in their jurisdiction have strains of HIV that are closely linked. Software that facilitates HIV phylogenetic analysis often represents clusters or transmission networks as square or circular nodes, each representing a person that are connected to each other by lines or what are called edges. Here are examples of HIV cluster maps from several peer-reviewed papers. Because MHS and CDR work is done under the power of public health, these programs are conducted without individual consent. And because of this, and because of the detailed information that HIV phylogenetics can reveal, such as detailed transmission patterns or even likely specific HIV transmission events, uses of HIV genetic sequence data in routine public health work have emerged as a huge source of concern among organized networks of people living with HIV, critical public health scholars, and a subset of other advocates. Here is a flyer from a session about MHS programs at AIDS Watch 2021, an advocacy event that was held virtually this year, but is usually at the US Capitol. The session was put on by the US People Living with HIV/AIDS Caucus, and at AIDS Watch 2019, people living with HIV also protested MHS, holding up signs with phrases that said things like, "I am not a cluster," "molecular HIV surveillance, not with my blood," and "without our consent." There was a similar protest of then CDC Director Robert Redfield at the 2019 US Conference on AIDS, a video of which is available on YouTube. And since 2019, organizations such as the Center for HIV Law and Policy and networks of people living with HIV, such as the Positive Women's Network USA and the US People Living with HIV/AIDS Caucus, have called for a moratorium on MHS. Last year, Positive Women's Network and the People Living with HIV/AIDS Caucus also included the call for a moratorium on these programs in public comments that they sent to the US Department of Health and Human Services during the composition of the updated US National HIV/AIDS Strategy. And just last week, these organizations released a public sign-on letter to CDC calling for an MHS and CDR moratorium, along with other demands, such as the addition of consent affordances into HIV surveillance, community oversight of MHS and CDR programs, and time limits on how long public health agencies should be allowed to store and use HIV surveillance data. The publication landscape about the ethics of MHS and CDR has also expanded over the last couple of years as these methods have proliferated. I highly recommend Fari Raimund-Hurwa's papers on the ethics of HIV phylogenetics, as well as the work of Carol Gallatley on the intersections of MHS and HIV criminalization, as well as critical criminologist Alexander McClellan's work and a recent article on HIV phylogenetic research ethics that was written by a panel convened by the US National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. As I mentioned last year, I was first author of a Target article about US HIV molecular cluster detection and response programs in the American Journal of Bioethics with co-author Anthony K.J. Smith, titled Reassessing the Ethics of Molecular HIV Surveillance in the Era of Cluster Detection and Response Toward HIV Data Justice. And that article reported a series of controversies about MHS and CDR programs, primarily focused on ethical issues and concerns that were publicly raised by advocates and people living with HIV during 2018 and early 2019. One editorial that was published in response to our article in that journal was written by a group of people living with HIV and critical public health scholars, and it was titled, "We Are People, Not Clusters." That editorial stridently and provocatively called for the abolition of MHS and CDR, a call to which I will actually directly respond in the conclusion of my remarks today. One of the most remarkable features of the recent history of HIV molecular cluster detection and response programs has been their rapid scale-up as a key pillar of the national HIV strategy, with a relatively thin evidence base to support their efficacy as public health interventions, and also without much stakeholder consultation or community engagement. And this has emerged as, these have all emerged as big points of angst. Multiple participants in my interview study who work on MHS at health departments expressed anger to me at CDC for not adequately consulting either them or community members before MHS and CDR interventions were rolled out in 2018. Participants in my study from networks of people living with HIV expressed even stronger sentiments of feeling left out of the process. So now that I've given us a sense of the background and the stakes for recent debates over MHS and CDR, I will move into elaborating my argument about why I believe these conflicts have broader implications for public health practice in the US. So recall my central argument, which is that the rollout of MHS and CDR programs in the US, along with critical reactions to the rollout that have been led by networks of people living with HIV, have shifted some of the basic terms of debate in regard to how US public health agencies ought to be permitted to collect and reuse individuals' routine clinical HIV data. Conflicts surrounding the rollout of MHS and CDR in the United States that have taken place since 2018 have revealed new ethical problems resulting from applications of HIV phylogenetics in public health programs. However, that is only one part of the story. That is because conflicts over molecular cluster detection and response also emerged from broader transformations in the US HIV public health data infrastructure and the US HIV strategy that developed during the 2010s, but went largely unproblematized by advocates until 2018, when MHS and CDR became mandated in all domestic jurisdictions. I've long wondered why molecular cluster detection and response caused advocates to raise questions about core public health practices, such as reuses of clinical HIV data for public health surveillance and prevention, which long precede MHS and CDR by about a half decade. To this point, the 2010s were a critical period when two key developments took place in the US health system, both of which changed the country's HIV strategy somewhat dramatically. The first development was that during the 2010s, HIV treatment as prevention emerged as the dominant approach to managing the epidemic. And while TASP was officially recognized and widely and publicly promoted as a domestic public health strategy by federal agencies starting only in 2017 or so, the efficacy of TASP was recognized in the scientific and public health community almost 10 years earlier. And in the US, the initial policy shift to TASP as a strategy starting around 2013 resulted in concerted efforts by federal health agencies to require states and localities to integrate their HIV care, surveillance, and prevention programs through integrated planning efforts and greater mandated cooperation between these three distinct divisions of the HIV public health sector in the US, that is care, surveillance, and prevention. Prevention mostly being partner services. The second development was that during the 2010s, the US health system was very rapidly digitized, owing to a series of massive federal spending packages that were designed to achieve this goal. The digitization of the health sector was critical to facilitating the integration of the US HIV response around a treatment as prevention strategy because it allowed public health agencies to electronically collect routinely gathered clinical HIV data from tests that are routinely ordered by providers for patients living with HIV. These are primarily CD4 T cell and viral loads that I've mentioned before. In 2013, state and local jurisdictional public health agencies were directed by CDC to systematically collect these data from testing labs and then to reuse them in surveillance and prevention programs that were designed at aiming people who were living with HIV who had fallen out of care and then bringing them back into care using a model that many of you are familiar with probably, called the HIV care continuum. And the main program in this area was called HIV Data to Care. It predates mandatory molecular and cluster detection and response programs by about 4 or 5 years. And in many ways, it is the infrastructural basis for MHS and CDR. So I published a paper about data to care in 2019 in the journal First Monday, and there is to the side of that paper the logo of the state of Georgia's HIV out of care watch list, or OWL, which it used to implement its data to care program to bring people back into care who had fallen out of care. It's an odd logo. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you'd like. So why do these two developments matter so much? While earlier work on the ethics of MHS and CDR, including my own, has tended to focus on new risks raised by applications of HIV phylogenetics in public health, such as risks from the identification of high transmitters in a population cohort, for example. My aim here is to complexify that story a little bit by drawing on my long-term policy and ethnographic research in this space, and also my recent interview study where many participants discussed with me how important the implementation of the HIV care continuum, data to care, and other earlier programs that were designed to support treatment as prevention as a public health strategy were just critical to laying the groundwork for molecular cluster detection and response. While uses of HIV phylogenetics in public health programs do raise specific ethical issues, I would like to suggest that the 2018 MHS and CDR mandate became a flashpoint of sorts that opened up a Pandora's box of issues that are more about the ethics of HIV surveillance and prevention in the era of treatment as prevention and digital health in general than they are specifically about uses of HIV phylogenetics in public health programs. As advocates have criticized the rollout of MHS and CDR, new risks stemming from applications of HIV phylogenetics in public health have been quite central. However, additionally, during the protests and debates that have taken place on multiple fronts in this area since 2018, those earlier developments in the US health data ecology that I was just talking about, which stem from the digitization of the health system and the reorientation of HIV surveillance and prevention around treatment as prevention earlier in the 2010s, have also been made acutely visible in new ways and then re-articulated or articulated in the first instance as problems by HIV advocates. And so, for example, reuses of individuals' clinical HIV data by public health agencies without consent has emerged as a central question in debates about MHS and CDR. But this is not only about molecular HIV data, but actually is about all sorts of different kinds of data that public health agencies have and use to contact and to conduct surveillance of people living with HIV. So for example, one of my study participants, who is a Black gay man living with HIV and a researcher, told me that every person's data is attached to a person, period. He then drew attention to the research interview encounter that we were actually engaged in at that moment, and he was not the only participant to do this. He went on saying, "You started off this session with a consenting process. I said you can use this information in ways that are aligned with this consent process. Why does the public health department not have to do that? Why do they not have to get consent for that?" I think that people living with HIV should have to consent. They should have the power of consent around their biological data, period. It is incumbent then upon the institutions to build trust and to build a sense of connection and whatever else it takes for people to say, oh, okay, yeah, you can use my data for these purposes. This participant statement resonates with public statements by networks of people living with HIV that have questioned whether public health agencies should be able to store HIV surveillance data in perpetuity, and have called on CDC to put time limits on uses of certain data and to provide consent affordances. However, none of the issues just discussed have anything specifically to do with HIV genetic sequence data or phylogenetic analysis in public health programs. Rather, these statements articulate concerns about bedrock practices in public health, such as the collection, storage, and use of individuals' clinical data without consent. This is very important to understand because the general sense in the US HIV community and multiple academic literatures that are concerned with these questions has been that these were issues that were settled during the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s during debates over the implementation of names-based HIV case reporting. However, critical reactions to molecular HIV surveillance and to cluster detection and response from multiple segments of the HIV movement have reopened these supposedly settled controversies, which question the ethical validity of several basic features of the US public health data infrastructure by drawing attention to changes in the ways that certain kinds of clinical HIV data are stored and reused. I hasten to add that that participant statement was just one perspective that emerged from my recent study. We will now discuss another perspective that represents a stratum of participants who recognize the benefits of conducting epidemiological surveillance and prevention without consent. So several participants I interviewed work or consult for health departments and were critical of the way that CDC rolled out molecular HIV surveillance and cluster detection and response, often because they did not feel like they were consulted by CDC prior to the rollout of the programs that they would actually have to implement, and that they were not empowered to engage their local HIV community advisory boards prior to rollout. However, these participants who work in public health pushed back against the idea that public health surveillance should require consent. So here is one demonstrative quotation from a participant who has worked and consulted for health departments for many years. She says, "I would say that public health surveillance can't work as a consent process. It can't. I mean, if you were investigating a salmonella outbreak, how effective do you think it would be if people could say, well, you told me I have this, but I don't want you to tell anybody? I mean, you couldn't figure out the source of a foodborne outbreak." I use that example because that's a much less stigma associated with that. It's not a consent process. It can't be a consent process. But because of that, CDC has done a tremendous amount of work, and I've worked with them over many years to protect the data. And I think by and large, CDC and the health departments have done an outstanding job protecting the data. But it was actually a little more complicated for this participant when we got to the question of sequence data. She went on. She said, in terms of the HIV genetic sequence data and the consent process, and I have said this to CDC's face, the argument has been, I would argue, disingenuous. When somebody comes in and gives consent, says, yes, please run a test to find out what strain of HIV you have so that you can know what drug to give me. Then the provider is not going to tell the patient that at the same time that's happening, the sequence data is going to the health department. Giving consent to have a sequence run so you can get the right medication is hardly a consent to do that. I have said since the very beginning of the work that I did with a large urban health department in the United States to providers, you need to tell the clients that their data are reported to the health department. While this participant recognized the complexities involved in the various ways that HIV genetic sequence data are collected and reused, with keen attention to the different clinical and public health contexts through which the data move, she pushes against the call for introducing consent into the process because she basically sees this as probably breaking the surveillance system, and surveillance is the primary way that epidemics come to be known and understood. Rather, like many health department personnel and consultants who I spoke with, about 6 or 7, she advocates that people living with HIV should be informed about how their data are used, and for CDC and providers to be active about doing this. So the title of this talk is New Struggles Over Hegemony in the Governance of HIV. And this is really what I'm talking about when I say that conflicts over MHS and CDR since 2018 have precipitated new struggles and debates over hegemony or effective dominance in the management of HIV epidemics, and the logics that underlie transformed HIV/AIDS prevention strategies and the conjoined eras of treatment as prevention and digital public health, to which you could add also genomic medicine and public health. When I say this, I mean that conflicts that have accompanied the rollout of MHS and CDR programs have altered some of the fundamental terms of debate about the kinds of data reuses that public health agencies ought to be allowed to undertake in the name of public health, particularly in regard to how and within what conditions public health reuses of individuals' clinical HIV data for surveillance and prevention outreach should be allowed without individuals' informed consent, without affording them the ability to opt out, or at least without going to some kind of great lengths to inform them of how their data are going to be used when they go to the health department. So when viewed in this light, I believe the implications of recent conflicts over MHS and CDR extend beyond the realm even of HIV and appear rather as a kind of microcosm for a burgeoning set of ethical problems, practical issues, and expanded zones of conflict and wars of position that are surrounding the implementation of digital public health programs generally. Public health agencies will need to contend with these issues in the era of digital health, where individuals' health data are increasingly interoperable and reusable for public health purposes, and also where patient movements and people in general are increasingly anxious about their health data and are demanding control over reuses of their information in healthcare and other contexts. So I've been following developments in US HIV surveillance and prevention policy and practice as a scholarly vocation for over half a decade now, and all of this has been tremendously complicated for me to make sense of and to describe. It's taken me years of reading many policy and public health operations documents, going to public meetings, attending webinars, publishing papers, engaging in debates with colleagues, having conversations with people, actually spending over 2 years in the field in metropolitan Atlanta's HIV/AIDS community, and engaging in a variety of forms of immersion, including just trying to exist in the world of social media chatter and kind of everything that goes into the production of an empirical foundation for developing an analysis of the political economy of HIV data in the contemporary US. So part of the reason this space is so complicated is because of the sheer range of institutions and individuals who are involved in making HIV policy and implementing programs across scales, ranging from the hyper-local, in a clinic room to global health policy. This is further complicated by the fact that almost no HIV activist who I have met only works in one context. Activists often serve on both local and national advisory boards and commissions, and almost every big national name in HIV policy and research who I met when I was in Atlanta is also actually engaged in the struggle against the virus in their local community there in the city. Everyone in the HIV world wears multiple hats. And I've struggled to find an analytical language that moved beyond the sorts of interesting but inherently limited ethical questions that fields like bioethics, public health ethics, and data ethics are well suited to answering, and which also went beyond the very interesting but often rather apolitical insights that fields such as science and technology studies can yield. Medical anthropologist Tony Sanset has drawn on Foucauldian biopolitics to describe some of the epistemic issues and ethical issues raised by MHS and CDR, and I commend you all to his work. However, Foucault only gets me so far when I'm thinking about transformations in public health infrastructures because his primary focus on the epistemologies that undergird regimes of governmentality can actually obscure the richness of the milieus from which these regimes of governmentality emerge in the first place. And so while I continue to draw on bioethics and STS to conceptualize HIV surveillance and prevention policy and conflicts over MHS and CDR, since my attention in this area has increasingly turned to larger problems in the political economy of public health data and its governance, I found that Marxist social and political theory to be much better suited to these sorts of problems. And I'm increasingly drawn to Gramscian theories of hegemony and struggles over hegemony to characterize how dominance in the governance of HIV has been achieved and sustained through ongoing and periodically escalating struggles and wars of position between competing interests and tendencies in state, industry, academia, civil society, and social movements that act upon one another in shifting fields of alliances that aim sometimes to wrest control from dominant factions or which can alternatively aim to sustain existing power structures. So I like to think about this in the rollout of MHS and CDR, but also TASC. While hegemony is often misconstrued to simply mean dominance over a particular area of state administration or the possession of state power, for Gramscians such as Joseph Buttigieg, Christine Bucci-Glucksmann, Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Maclot, and others, hegemony is a constantly modulating terrain of ongoing struggles amongst and against competing interests in state and civil society, where the terms of that struggle often shift, intensifying during certain periods and settling during others. If I have one overarching finding on my research on US molecular HIV surveillance and cluster response programs, it is that the space is currently in a period of very intense struggle where old lines of conflict in the war of position in the governance of HIV data infrastructures that had thought to have been largely settled, such as the question of consent and public health surveillance or the duration of time that a health department can hold on to an individual's data, have not only been reopened, but they've actually been turned into expansive and expanding territories of multiplying, intensifying, and active conflict as the rollout of MHS and CDR proceeds nationally, but also in specific local jurisdictions, right? There's something like 57 funded jurisdictions to do this work. My desire to map out this terrain was a primary motivator of the interview study that I've quoted a couple of participants from, which I've been discussing today. I wanted to conduct a study of how dissent about MHS and CDR is reshaping the politics of HIV surveillance and prevention in the United States. And further, the study's aim and my early findings reflect my commitment to speaking back to scientific and public health institutions in a way that Anthony K.J. Smith and I characterize in our article as, quote, an intentional counterweight to forms of optimism that often accompany the implementation of novel technologies in the practice of healthcare, public health, and biomedical research. For me, those commitments are really at the core of a critical bioethics practice. However, as I move into my conclusion, I want to be clear about what I'm not trying to do with this work. And so when constructing this study and presenting the results of my early analysis today, I've deliberately sought not to simply recapitulate, elevate, or confirm or affirm critiques that have already been made publicly by critics of molecular cluster detection and response. This was not the point of my study. Rather, I want to better understand criticisms and concerns throughout the full assemblage of actors who have criticisms and concerns about these programs, including the concerns of actors who are often not empowered to state their concerns publicly, and who are also often in the position of implementing molecular HIV surveillance and cluster response programs, such as the participants in this study who work for departments of public health, who make up actually about a quarter of my sample. Further, while my work in this area makes it apparent that I hold certain sympathies, if you read my papers about it, I, for example, think that there is a need to explore at least the possibility of introducing consent in HIV surveillance. I am not aligned with any tendency or faction in the current war of position over MHS and CDR. And my findings lead me to believe that there are several tendencies and actual pretty well-formed factions that are solidifying in this area that exist along a spectrum from abolitionists to being people who I characterize as generally supportive but with some concerns. And all these people, I interviewed people along that whole spectrum. I see it as my role as a critical bioethicist to understand the political economy of MHS and CDR and to make interventions that are aimed at illuminating perspectives that will hold institutions accountable to what they say their priorities are, such as ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic, while also maximizing bioethical principles such as autonomy, justice, and beneficence for the people most affected by MHS and CDR. This takes balancing between the reporting of my findings and actually the construction of the study itself and my subjectivity as a critical health researcher. And this balancing is part of my practice of scholarly reflexivity in my methodology. I'm analyzing the data using reflexive thematic analysis, by the way. In this respect, I have something to say in conclusion about one aspect of the critical discourse about MHS and CDR that is currently in a wide circulation right now amongst the communities of activists in this area. It bears on the question of abolition and calls to abolish MHS and CDR programs along with other public health practices. The abolitionist line in critiques of MHS and CDR has been advanced by critical HIV scholars and advocates, including people living with HIV in the We Are People, Not Clusters editorial in the American Journal of Bioethics. That was actually in response to my article with Anthony K.J. Smith. And so the authors of that editorial, Bernard et al., write, quote, "What MHS demonstrates is that we are still fighting to access self-determination and informed decision-making about our lives. But this is more than an issue of violating consent, however egregious, or the specific practices of MHS. This is about undoing the objectifying, othering logic of public health actors and medical researchers. We must work toward the abolition of such logic, which views the bodies and blood of people living with HIV, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, immigrant people, and other people of color, people who use drugs, people who sell sex, trans women, and gay men, as objects to be studied without consent under the justification of the quote-unquote public good," end quote. So this is a powerful statement and a powerful demand. Further, the abolitionist tendency is a forceful one that has now been introduced into the HIV public health policy discourse. The abolitionist position is a position that I respect very deeply, and I also think that I understand the scope of the abolitionist demand in this space and believe that public health institutions implementing MHS and CDR programs should consider the reasons behind the abolitionist demand in its full breadth and in all of its complex dimensions. In some contexts, for example, I'm an abolitionist, And this is part of why I think I understand the seriousness of the abolitionist demand in regard to MHS and CDR. I am, for example, for the abolition of the death penalty and of prisons and police. However, in the context of MHS, CDR, and public health in general, I am not an abolitionist. And I want to take the opportunity I have here at ARCSHS to make that clear and to explain why this is as I wrap up. And so in sum, while I share the sentiments of the plurality of the participants in my recent interview study that HIV surveillance needs to be reimagined, and also believe that this reimagining should involve the introduction of new consent affordances into HIV surveillance and prevention. The introduction of consent into public health practice would involve a total remaking and reimagining of what HIV surveillance is. And this is because mandatory disease reporting and consent by definition cannot coexist. The phrase mandatory consent is on its face a logical fallacy and an empirical impossibility. However, the difficulty of accomplishing a total reimagination of public health surveillance to include consent affordances is not the primary reason why I am not an abolitionist in regard to MHS and CDR. Rather, I am not an abolitionist and do not advance an abolitionist line in this field because abolition, to me and the abolitionists that I've worked with, means the total and immediate elimination of a system, problem, or technology of social control. So calling for the abolition of chattel slavery, for example, meant the immediate and total abolition of slavery to be followed by Reconstruction. It didn't mean that slavery would get to persist for a few more years so that there would be a gradual transition. It meant that slavery had to end immediately. That was the starting point. To take another example, the abolition of the death penalty is not a demand for this to happen slowly, as if to say, okay, United States, you can kill 35 more inmates and then the death penalty can end. That's not what it means. Abolishing the death penalty means the state should not kill anyone using the death penalty starting now. Abolition means immediately ending an institution or practice because of the extreme forms of violence that it inflicts. The system must be so heinous that it cannot be allowed to stand even for one more day. And so, at least for myself, this position is not a viable one in regard to HIV surveillance and public health programming or generally in the politics of healthcare. To abolish HIV surveillance would mean literally that, to make it go away tomorrow, including the jobs of all the people who work with the surveillance systems, all of the data, all the systems, and all the knowledge. Taking the abolitionist position seriously means that all of that would need to be eviscerated, really by almost any means necessary. In my assessment, this sort of action would not only not be in the best interest of public health, but also not be in the best interest of people living with and affected by HIV. Without HIV surveillance, HIV epidemics could not be known. Institutions, and therefore society, would be left flying blind about the challenges that lie before us. I also note that abolition was not a word which any of the participants in my interview study used, not even once. And my interview study included conversations with some very righteous and politically radical people. So in conclusion, rather than agreeing with calls for the abolition of MHS and CDR, I hew more closely to the other side of this demand, which is the call to reimagine how public health work takes place and to achieve this through collective struggle. I share in and elevate the calls for the reimagination of HIV surveillance and public health to include consent affordances, community controls, as well as other demands that actors in this space are making, including for universal access to care, housing, and supportive services. However, achieving this vision should not entail the abolition of HIV surveillance. Rather, it should take the form of a seizure of the public health apparatus by democratic and political means, constructing a new hegemony that is driven by the power that exists within movements of advocates of public health workers, academics, people living with HIV, and those who want it. It would involve a shift from what Gramsci calls a war of position to a war of movement, where a new hegemony could emerge. So, as final words, while I'm not an abolitionist in matters of health, and if any of my study participants, I'm not an abolitionist in matters of health, and if any of my study participants were, they did not foreground their abolitionist critiques. However, I reiterate that I admire abolitionists organizing in HIV today, and I hope that institutional public health actors start taking them seriously, because abolition is very serious business, and I do not think that institutional public health actors yet grasp the scope of the abolitionist demand. Finally, I will reiterate that that it is nice to see an abolitionist tendency rising in HIV, even though I am not of that tendency. This is because both Marxists and AIDS activists know, perhaps better than any other group, that history tends to move a little faster when there are uncompromising voices staking out radical territories and struggles over hegemony and the governance of life. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you so much, Stephen. That was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? As I mentioned at the beginning, if people do have hands raised already, I'm going to allow you to talk. Kate, if anyone in the meantime wants to chuck a question in the chat box, feel free, or we've got hands up already, so let's get going.
No, should I stop sharing my screen? I can't see much.
Oh, okay, yep, stop. So, yeah, Kate, you should be able to speak now.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Thanks, Renee. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Thanks, Renee, and thanks, Stephen. It was really interesting and just absolutely fascinating what's going on in the US, and some parallels emerging here too, I think. I wanted to ask a specific question that was triggered by one of the quotes you had from one of your participants, and your observation early on that these developments have potential implications for public health in the US generally. And I just wonder basically if there's some value in not lumping different diseases, conditions and issues together. So the participant who talked about salmonella, for example, was drawing an analogy to HIV that obviously doesn't really hold up in my view. And it made me think about Isabel Stenger's work on the politics of comparison. And I'm interested if you think, or what your thoughts are on the politics of lumping things together or combining diseases, conditions and issues, if there are risks to doing that, and what your reflections might be.
Thank you for this fascinating question, which I have a range of responses to, in part because I myself have moved since I started studying HIV phylogenetics. I've also now moved into the ethics of tuberculosis phylogenetics, and I'm on a genomic TB transmission study in a bioethics role, and also have written papers about SARS-CoV-2 genomics, which of course is the source of all of the discourse about variants, and have kind of overtaken the media in the last few months. And so I have a couple of responses. The first one is that I also had that same reaction, almost didn't include the quote because of the comparison to salmonella. So this is a very common strategy of CDC in justifying the fast, non-problematic rollout of molecular HIV surveillance and cluster response, which is this line that, well, we've been doing this with other pathogens all the time, for example, foodborne illness. And it's like, well, hello. Anyone who's ever worked in HIV knows that that is a horrible comparison to make. There's salmonella and HIV are only alike in the sense that they make people sick, and they make people sick in totally different ways. They're just not comparable in any way. On the other hand, so that's a problem, and I think that her comparison was a problem, although I got what she was trying to do. The other side of this, though, is I work with the data scientists who are doing this work, and data science, this whole thing, and David Rebus's work on domains, the logic of domains is really good here. Data science's whole thing is that it doesn't respect domain knowledge. It moves across, as long as there's data science says it can come and it can solve the problem as long as there's data to analyze. And so what happens is people who build these phylogenetic software packages build them to work across multiple pathogens, and then or people will take a tool that was developed for a specific pathogen and try to use it on another. These are open source software tools, so anyone can access them. And this actually causes a lot of problems that I'm just sort of starting to begin to understand. But it also has actually opened up in some ways really useful ways for people to speak to each other across domains of infectious disease practice. So I'm really actually committed to thinking about this, and that book, The Problem of Comparison, I'm going to look it up because it sounds fascinating, and I hope I answered your question all right. So I'm both guilty of doing the thing, but also trying to understand it, because everyone in this space, including people at health departments, are always moving in between pathogens. You know, at a lot of health departments, their HIV partner services are grouped with their chlamydia and gonorrhea and syphilis partner services, which arguably are two completely different things too, right? And so this is happening all over the place. And I think in each space, it happens in different configurations that need to be understood in their specificity, but also kind of in the big picture.
You want to say anything, Kate, or I'll go on to the next question? I'll move on. Oh, here you are.
I was just going to say it's The Politics of Comparison.
The Politics of Comparison. Thank you.
A paper by Isabel Stengers. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Brent, I can see you've got your hand up, so I'm just allowing you to talk now, so you should be able to.
Hey, Stephen, I thought that was an amazing presentation. I think that there are, however, some confounding factors around what the public thinks as opposed to what we may think as people living with HIV or those in the HIV sector. And I guess my question to you is about how do we make it amiable to a public that is afraid of HIV? And we've inculcated this. So, I mean, we have created this. How do we make it amiable that we can do something other than phylogenetic testing or trace testing or cluster testing?
Yeah, no, so I have this paper that I'm working on that I'd like to submit to an STS journal called HIV's New Molecular Publics, where I kind of think about the different scientific communities of practice, state administrative publics, because the thing is, you know, in my world coming from critical theory, you know, everything is discursively mediated. So each of these tools has a public, each of these, you know, also there are publics being created all the time when cluster response events happen, and it's flashed in the news media, either because they got a hold of it or because also media engagement is part of these cluster response events. That's, you know, a huge cluster in this part of town, or homeless people injecting drugs are shown to have a cluster of HIV. So there are these problematic publics that can be formed. And I don't think that I have engaged the question quite the way that you say it, which is how do we, if I'm understanding it right, is like, how could we create a kind of a way of framing these issues for a mass public that talked about other kinds of ways of thinking about HIV and HIV prevention and surveillance. And so the answer to this, I think, has been U equals U, right? However, we've also seen, particularly in places like the United States, where I still don't think we're cracking 60% viral suppression, how that's very exclusionary. And in the US, I know in Atlanta, the health department, the local health department in Atlanta refused to use U equals U messaging because it just did not apply to their clients, because their patients were constantly falling in and out of care. And so I have problems falling back on U equals U. You know, if I were to just like venture an answer to your question, it would probably be, you know, something along the lines of trying to actually think about framing, you know, HIV as about kind of deproblematizing seroconversion, because this has always been kind of the tension in HIV prevention, which is that, you know, you know, you really should be trying not to get, this is kind of a pre-prep discourse, right? Where it's like, oh, you should really be trying not to get HIV, but then if you get it, it's not a problem. And so this is kind of a dialectical tension that structures HIV prevention. And so I don't know if I have a clear answer to your question, but that might be where I would want to start. But I am very interested in thinking about social theory concerned with publics and these technologies.
I guess the reason I ask this question is because I've found the Australian public to be very complicit in the notion around COVID infections, and the fact that someone's COVID infection can be traced back to an individual. And there appears to be absolutely no debate about the ethics of that, and how, frankly, inappropriate that could be in some ways. Now, one could say, because I'm not an abolitionist, I don't think that we should absolve all this, but I can't help but think that our general public, I'm talking about the Australian public here, is becoming accustomed to the notion that you track back. And that's completely okay, because we did it with COVID.
Well, and in a way, this is an underlying epistemology in terms of infectious diseases. I mean, you should really check out Richard McKay's The Patient Zero and the Making of the AIDS Epidemic, which is excellent. And also actually a part of that is showing that this epistemology of the cluster and the index case is at the root of, you know, the first reported cases of HIV surveillance in the 80s. And then now it's kind of reemerged, which he doesn't talk about, but in this, you know, new formulation of HIV phylogenetics. But this whole, the index testing and like, this is still a part of, and actually increasingly a part of HIV prevention, and HIV phylogenetics are all simultaneously organized around finding and building prevention programs around an index case, which is like kind of a mini patient zero. Yeah. But then at the same time, they're saying, but we can't say that who infected who. So there's all these logical disconnects going on. I would really encourage you to check out McKay's book, though. It addresses this question better than anyone I have probably encountered, including, I would say, I think he even does it better than Douglas Crimp. But yeah, it's a good book.
Great, thanks, Stephen.
I think that actually takes us up now to 5 p.m. or which I think is some ludicrous hour. Maybe, what was it? No, is it midnight or 11 p.m.?
It's now just turned midnight. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. We're so thankful, and I'm sure everyone here would join me in thanking you if we were in person for presenting at this very late hour. It was a really fascinating presentation. Everyone here today, that'll be going up online soon on the ARCSHS website.
Yeah,
oh, do you want to revisit some of the ideas in the presentation again? So thank you so much, Stephen. And just before we go, I'll just say that our next presentation is by Professor Celia Roberts from ANU, our next seminar, sorry. Celia will be presenting on the 21st of July at 4 p.m. on pregnancy, birth and parenting during the Australian bushfires and COVID-19 pandemic. So I hope you join us then. But yes, thank you so much, Stephen. And I don't know if you want to say a final farewell.
Oh, hey, thank you everyone very much for coming. Thank you very much for the invitation, Renee. It was a pleasure to be here at ARCSHS, and hopefully, and sometime in the future, we'll be together in person.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Right.
And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And yeah, I'll see you at the next seminar. Bye.
Bye-bye.